thank you very much to all of you for coming out on a very beautiful evening where no doubt you'd be extremely happy to be out by the water. This is a talk that, as I was putting it together, started as sort of 10 lesser known, less sort of understood truths of the climate security space, and then it kind of bloated like a beached whale into 12, and then 15. But ultimately we'll see how much time we've got, how long that can sort of hold your attention. I've also been instructed by my publishers to shamelessly flog this book whenever available, so to that end, in the talk that I gave down at Duke last week, I managed to knock the book off on 5 different occasions, so I'm looking to improve on that record. I've got a bunch of photographs which I'm going to use as something of a kind of backing track, in part to illustrate my points, but in part so you've got something to look at as I drone on. I was, as Peter said, mostly a writer for National Geographic. However, I was definitively not a photographer, so these are almost all by significantly more talented photographic colleagues, and it's rather evident which ones of my own have sort of crept into the mix. So I guess the first point I'm going to make, or one of the single biggest takeaways that I would like people to sort of get from the book, is the idea that we are massively underestimating the degree of violence related to climate change. And that's because we are not necessarily, and this is something that remains as true of many people within my own field, known as climate security, as it does beyond. And that's because we're not fully taking into account how climate change is acting on other drivers of instability, such as corruption, such as inequality, such as misinformation. We're going to get into some of that. But also such as, as corruption. So, if any of you have heard anything about the nature of climate-related violence, it is perhaps most likely to be in the context of Syria. And that's because since about the day that war really kicked off in absolute earnest, about 2012, 2013, there's been a very kind of energetic, navel-gazing back and forth in certain scholarly circles about the nature of climate change's contribution. Kind of the more that I myself have sort of worked in various parts of Syria since about 2014, the more I've sort of come to, I think at least, sort of better understand where corruption, where climate is sort of fitting into that kind of wider, messy mosaic of factors that contributed to the instability. And so this is a farming family that I met near Haska in the far northeast of the country in about 2014. And the way that the story was presented to me was that this family, as with basically all others there, had to contend with varying degrees of corruption, kind of official demands among agriculture types and others for kickbacks in the years running up to the drought, which intensified from about 2008 onwards. But as the drought replicated itself year after year, through until about 2012, this family's capacity to kind of make good on these bribe-seeking demands from local officials steadily diminished. So it's not so much that the corruption intensified, it's that in a kind of climate-battered world, the family's capacity to actually contend with those long-standing corrupt demands diminished. And so when the protests began in earnest in about 2011, the father figure, the husband figure in this family was among the very first to protest, and a little bit later to take up arms, and he was killed fighting ISIS in about 2018. A broadly related point is that there are increasingly few forms of violence out there that don't have some sort of climate angle. Now, it doesn't mean that it's a big part. It never means that it's the only part. And sometimes it's a little bit tangential, but I'm going to sort of, if you have a look at all 3 of the major conflicts that we see globally at the moment, each one of them has some kind of climate element. So in Sudan, for example, this is a kind of oil-producing chunk of southern Darfur that I visited in about 2018. In Darfur, the Rapid Support Forces, who were the kind of descendants of the Janjaweed militia that were responsible for perpetrating much of the genocide there about a decade and a half ago, have benefited tremendously from their access to cheap, heavily subsidized Libyan fuel, which spills over the border. And this has been a tremendous advantage for them because they've been able to kind of range their vehicles over the enormous distances in the country with much greater facility than that of their armed force peers. Equally, there is an argument to be made that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was at least partly a fossil fuel-fed phenomenon. The kind of natural gas and oil riches that the Putin regime had at their disposal certainly allowed them to kind of gird themselves to the series of sanctions that the regime absolutely knew to be coming. And I promised to go a little bit light on statistics, but came across the most extraordinary one from the OECD the other day, which is that the very fact that Western airlines have not been able to cross Russian airspace in the last 2.5 years has collectively resulted in the same additional annual emissions tally as Kenya produces every year, a country of 50-something billion people. And then finally, of course, the situation in Gaza and Lebanon. There, the kind of impact is a little bit even more sort of tangential, but the very fact that the COP climate talks in Dubai last year were sort of even more disappointing than many of us had deemed possible was in part because so much of the diplomatic energy had been sort of sucked out of the room as a consequence of the sort of global frenzy attached to that particular conflict. Now, I sort of briefly touched on one of climate's pathways to violence, the manner in which it is kind of intermingled and merged with corruption in the Syrian context. But there are, of course, many. Now, you might have heard of the threat multiplier formulation. It sort of evokes the idea that climate change is sort of throwing the equivalent of fuel on already smoldering fires. And there's certainly a tremendous degree of truth to that. But in these 10, 11 or so years, 12, in which I've been working in conflict climate settings, I've increasingly come to think of the single biggest, most important pathway from climate through to violence as being the way in which climate is sort of undermining many of the coping mechanisms, many of the kind of structural support systems that individuals, communities, and even nation states turn to at times of crisis. A way of sort of illustrating that point, this particular character is a guy called Omar, who I met over a particularly grim few days in about 2017. He'd been charged, along with a few of his colleagues, with kind of scanning back and forth along the Tigris River, the city of Mosul, in a kind of crater bridge in the background, looking for the bodies of ISIS fighters and ISIS victims that had kind of washed up in the reeds on either side. But he was an interesting character because he'd previously been a fisherman. He had spent almost the entirety of his life till that date plying the waters of the Tigris until a combination of climate-induced drought and horrific pollution had dropped his fishing role to the point where it was just no longer economically viable. And because those conditions were replicating themselves year after year after year, he had finally taken a step that he'd been resisting until then, which was sort of joining the Iraqi army. He was an extremely sensitive, calm soul, like someone who was seemingly woefully ill-suited to any kind of life in uniform. And his brother, a fellow fisherman, had taken a similar step on account of the kind of depletion of financial savings, depletion of psychological reserves, on account of just the sheer impossibility of working in those conditions. And the brother had died in the fight to liberate Mosul from ISIS the year before. Now, you may have heard of the idea of kind of absolute resource scarcity and the kind of impending supposed water wars that many of my more sensationalist media colleagues have sometimes suggested are imminent. But the thing that I've found over the course of all that reporting is that many of those who I interview, many of those who I communicate with in these settings, talk much more about the unpredictability that climate change is fueling, rather than the absolute scarcity that it is sometimes inflicting in various parts of the world. And that's because if you are an agrarian, you are a farmer, you are a herder, the thing that you need above all else is certainty. You need to know when to plant up your fields, you need to know when to harvest them, and as a pastoralist, an animal herder, you need to know when to migrate with your livestock in the kind of itinerant, semi-nomadic manner in which many of them do. And so the more erratic the rainfall, the more complicated their lives become. And beyond a certain level, it doesn't really matter whether the rains are extra rich, as indeed they are in various parts of the world, if it's almost impossible to sort of predict or categorize when they will come. Just a way of illustrating that is with these extremely scrawny zebu cattle that I followed for about 3 days in part of Burkina Faso in late 2017. This was meant to be the height of the rainy season, but as you can see, the landscape is not far off bone dry. These cattle around this period of the year were meant to be weighing up to a ton, and as you can see, many of them are roughly a third of that, which boded very ill for their capacity to survive through the normal dry season. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about climate security risks is that predictably, perhaps, they filter into the other sort of hot topics of the day. And for one, I mean, misinformation and disinformation permeates this field every bit as much as it does many others. I mean, to go back for one moment to these animals, across a large part of West and Central Africa, you have this mushrooming series of fights between farmers and herders. And a good deal of that is grounded in the very fact that there's much less adequate pasture land to go around. But it's also being turbocharged by a wealth of fake news, particularly on French language or kind of local West African language Facebook, much of which is depicting many of these itinerant animal herders as being kind of in hoc to the various jihadi groups that are intensely problematic in that part of the world. Equally, I mean, this is an Egyptian soldier standing alongside the Aswan High Dam in the far south of Egypt. And the kind of Nile water dispute in which Egypt and Ethiopia in particular have been at one another's throats for the past 11 or 12 years is sometimes cited as sort of ground zero or kind of case in point number one of many of the transboundary water clashes that are thought likely to pick up in the future. And ultimately it's possible, but so much of the worst tension in that particular conflict is not so much grounded in genuine fears of insufficient water, it's grounded in the profound misunderstanding of one another's motivations and of one another's rationales, more than anything else. And then for another crossover point, I mean, discussion of climate can consider, discussion of climate stresses are merging with many of the non-climate environmental troubles that are intensely problematic in much of the world. I mean, if you look at a kind of list of the most kind of climate vulnerable countries in the world, and you look to compare that to countries that are suffering from kind of terribly degraded landscapes on account of pollution, on account of neglect, on account of conflict, it's very often one and the same. And the problem there is that when you have a natural landscape that has already suffered from, I don't know, an array of other supposedly prosaic environmental troubles, such as pollution, such as groundwater depletion, such as kind of poorly maintained infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily take much in the way of a climate stress to kind of push people or push communities that little bit further, that kind of bridge too far. Way of illustrating that, these kind of two Iraqi forest rangers that I accompanied for a few days on their patrols along the Iran-Iraq border a number of years back. And among their primary duties, they were charged with reining in pretty prolific illicit tree cutting in that area. But despite the fact that Iraq is a country sort of in theory awash with gasoline, they were granted a weekly fuel allowance of about 20 litres, thereby ensuring that they had to do the vast majority of their patrolling on foot. And there were quite a few instances where we could hear the very sort of telltale whine of chainsaws in the background. But by the time we got there, the tree cutters had long since made themselves scarce. And the idea there is that at a time when kind of climate-induced wildfires are really picking up pretty dramatically, many of the worst kind of loss of vegetation is coming in ways that authorities are theoretically pretty well placed to tackle, but that they're simply not granted the resources to do so. And then maybe a third kind of crossover point, and that's that climate change's contribution to poverty is problematic, but it's much more the way in which it is turbocharging existing inequalities that is bleeding into violence. And the reality is that kind of both in poor and rich countries, rural communities tend to be a good deal poorer than their urban equivalents. And as climate change kind of strikes agriculture in particular, it's widening that already kind of yawning gulf between kind of villager and urbanite degrees of prosperity. So between about 2014 and 2017, I spent many, many months traveling around different parts of Iraq and Syria, looking at how ISIS had kind of taken advantage of collapsing agricultural conditions due to climate-related phenomena and other, in order to kind of pad its ranks. And I found that some of the biggest, most disproportionate volumes of ISIS recruitment came from the villages on the kind of northern and eastern peripheries of the city of Mosul. This is part of East Mosul, a bunch of locals running from an ISIS, the aftermath of an ISIS car bomb in the background. And what was striking about that particular finding was that a lot of these villages around Mosul were by no means the poorest of the poor. They had many amenities that their poorer, kind of much more peripheral counterparts in more isolated regions could only dream of. But what they did have was a close proximity to the city. And so they could see up close on a kind of almost daily basis how their own farming-dependent livelihoods were crumbling and crumbling and crumbling, at the same time as the livelihoods of the people in the city were stagnating in many instances, or in some instances sort of improving that bit steadily. And to kind of maximize that disparity, there was also a sense that at a time when they were suffering the most, it was the urbanites in slightly richer Mosul who were getting significantly greater degrees of government assistance. And that kind of bled into strong degrees of kind of pre-existing grievance and resentment that a lot of these kind of ISIS recruiters, when they came along, were very unfortunately able to effectively harness. Now, for the time being, most climate-related violence is relatively low level, affecting people in sort of local communities in ways that can be intensely problematic for them, but it doesn't necessarily have kind of big global geopolitical fallouts in a way that perhaps the ISIS example did. But that doesn't make any of this any less punishing for the tens or perhaps at this point even hundreds of millions who are in the eye of this particular storm. A few points that I want to make here. This is a village in the very far south of Jordan, one of about 20 that I kind of went back and forth to over a period of 2 or 3 years. And a lot of these villages are losing anywhere from 10 to 50% of their populations to migration. And it's a familiar refrain, a familiar tale. I mean, the economies are almost wholly dependent on agriculture and herding, and as those livelihoods stumble from one problem to another, many people are just simply had enough and they're up in sticks and moving to the city. And so when we look at migration, there's an understandable tendency to look at the migrants themselves or the host communities that they're gravitating to. But kind of often lost amid that focus is in a concentration on what this means for the communities that are being left behind. So many of them are losing the critical mass of residents that they need to sustain small businesses. And among the first things to go are often whatever passes for entertainment, cafes, restaurants, and the like, which is contributing to kind of the epidemic of loneliness that migrant places face. But even more than that, when people migrate, it's almost always the most talented or among kind of the best and brightest who are among the first to go. And in their absence, a lot of the kind of local conflict resolution mechanisms, the local kind of groups and bodies that were kind of responsible for keeping the peace, are either not functioning as they once did, or they're just straight up falling apart. And so, in an Iraqi context for a moment, a lot of these villages that kind of ISIS recruiters were making inroads in, they weren't so much communities as they were kind of clusters of individuals that were kind of riven with disputes, big and small. And in a Jordanian context, I mean, in a lot of these villages, as with a lot of their, historically, a lot of their European and North American equivalents, people wouldn't even have dreamed of kind of locking their doors, locking their cars. But as kind of the social cohesion, as the kind of village dynamics break down, in large part due to climate-related outmigration, there's these kind of real little epidemics of law breaking, and that, of course, becomes something of a grim spiral. Like when locals start to lose trust in their neighbors, well, it's extremely hard to win that back. So that's the now, but in the long run, the single biggest climate-related security challenge remains the capacity of kind of climate stresses and climate shocks to undermine or damage state performance and thereby contribute to greater degrees of anti-state sentiment. And what we're seeing globally is a kind of shrinking trust in government, or shrinking kind of faith in states' capacity to get anything done. And particularly in a lot of poorer places, there's a very distinct climate angle to that. The very fact that a lot of these, this is a picture of in Nepal, which I'll get to in a second, but the very fact that that kind of states are finding it that bit harder to deliver sufficient fresh water, finding it that bit harder to provide sufficient wastewater disposal, that bit harder to kind of maintain infrastructure to an effective standard, is being intensified by this array of climate stresses that are coming their way, particularly in poor countries where already overstretched budgets are not well placed to suit many of the cleanup bills and repair bills that come with these various stresses. But even more than that, when you have failing state performance, it creates openings for often unsatisfactory or often predatory non-state alternatives to kind of step into the void. So in the case of Nepal, where the government once was relatively effective, certainly in urban areas, at providing sufficient piped fresh water, its inability to do so now has created an opening for these water tanker operators, water tanker mafias, many of which charge rates that are many times higher than that of the old state delivery, and many of which deliver water that is of much worse quality than is advertised. And the very fact, in a Nepali context, that water has crumbled in communities that are on the doorstep of the Himalayas, the world's biggest water tower, is just seen as a kind of flashing neon in-your-face illustration of the state's illegitimacy, of its kind of failure to work in the most obvious of circumstances. But in other instances, as in Iraq, it's a kind of much more nefarious series of challenges that's opening up as a partial consequence. The very fact that state is not performing the duties that many of these citizens expect is leading many people to kind of cast around for alternatives. And that's a variation of how ISIS presented itself to many of these deeply unhappy, ever poorer, frequently embittered villages in Iraq and Syria. It's like Baghdad or Damascus have abandoned you, and in abrogating their right to rule, they are granting us a chance. Now, I imagine all of this is getting a little bit dispiriting at this point, and I promise there will be a few points of sort of relative strands of hope or sort of relative optimism to grab onto towards the end. But I'll compound the misery of them a little bit more. And that's that in this kind of particularly knotty series of circumstances, states' ability to deal with problems which are kind of generally an unhappy marriage of climate stress and poor governance is often being compromised by those very same climate stresses. So one of the parts of the book that I most enjoyed exploring was sort of piracy in coastal Bangladeshi waters. And this was a situation that I stumbled on almost by accident when a completely unrelated assignment. And basically what's going on is that as seas rise in the Bay of Bengal and as crop yields among many farmers' fields shrink in a commensurate fashion, many of these farmers are turning to fishing, which is basically the only alternative livelihood in that part of the country. And in doing so, they are basically sailing like pigs to the slaughter into waters that are plied by many of these, the Jalabush, these water bandits. And the more that the number of fishermen increases, the more lucrative it is to be a pirate. They derive much of their living by kidnapping fishermen and honey collectors and an array of others and holding them for ransom. And a few years back, the Bangladeshi state took it upon itself to very belatedly try and kind of rein in this form of kind of water banditry in the kind of southwestern corner of the country. But at roughly the same time as they kind of finally, after years, kind of incentivized themselves to act, along came a monster-type cyclone which tore away many of the roads that the something called the Rapid Action Battalion, a kind of paramilitary police force, were planning to use to kind of rein in many of the pirate lairs. So at a time when you most need various tools, various bits of kind of state capacity in order to deal with climate stress, those very same climate stresses are often undermining that capacity. It's a particularly intractable issue. And to add to it all, I mean, how we as global states react to climate change is itself sometimes capable of triggering as much violence, if not more, than the initial challenges. I mean, decarbonization is profoundly necessary, but it has to be done savvily, it has to be done in a manner that is sort of sensitive to local needs. And just a particularly egregious illustration of where this is going particularly wrong. In Sudan, many Gulf Arab agribusinesses, Saudi, Emirati, Qatari operations have been snapping up large portions of arable land along or near the Nile Valley. And among the many reasons why they're doing this is because in a sort of hotter, more complicated world that they anticipate arising out of climate change, they are deeply wary of their near total dependence on international markets for imports. You are Saudi, you are UAE, you are reliant on imports for 90% plus of your crop staples. And at a time when major food exporters, such as India, such as Vietnam, such as Russia, have displayed a willingness during periods of food crunches to slap export bans for fear of rising prices affecting their own voters or their own communities, those that are near wholly dependent on the international market are deeply wary of what this means for them. So if you are a cynical, well-moneyed actor like many of the Gulf states, well, essentially snapping up land, much of which, of course, is owned by other people, can seem like a rather attractive response mechanism. Now, I mean, some of the time, not kind of less than back in the day, but some of the time I get a kind of a bit of a so what factor. Like, why is this important? To be sure, there's always been varying degrees of poverty and instability, particularly in many of the countries that I've been talking about. There's two reasons. One of them I'll get to in a few points' time. One of them is that problems in this kind of extremely interdependent world do not remain nice little self-contained messes. They almost invariably come to affect us. So much of this climate-related instability is, of course, playing out in rural areas. It's agriculture that is itself the most acutely climate-vulnerable livelihood. Many of these villages, on account of decades-long processes of neglect, simply have no alternatives to agriculture, and many states lack either the wherewithal or the capacity to actually provide alternatives. And as a consequence, that rural problem is itself becoming something of an urban problem. This is a not very good photo of mine that I shot on the kind of southern periphery of Baghdad. And this is one of a number of areas where you have fast intensifying fights between different cohorts of agricultural laborers, of different cohorts of construction workers. And that's because, of course, Baghdad, as with many of its urban competitors, has an existing cohort of day laborers, many of whom are now coming up against migrants from rural areas, many of whom lack the skills for anything but day labor in an urban workplace. And naturally, the existing cohort do not welcome the increased competition, not least because many construction bosses take advantage of the situation to depress wages. And so, just around the corner from here, as in a few other occasions, came across pretty mega fights on construction sites between folks who are either unhappy with one another, or in many instances, be unhappy with the construction bosses for exploiting them. Equally, as we really ought to have learned over the last 10, 15, or 20 years, problems in poor countries quite quickly spill over borders in the form of migration flows, in the form of terrorism, in the form of all the troubles that come with failing states. So that's part of the so what factor. Can't really remember what point I was planning to make here, but this was one of the most hellish spots I've ever visited. It was a granite quarry on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, and it was pretty hot at ground level. I'd say probably 110, 115, but about 100, 200 meters down in this space where many of the laborers were burning tires in order to soften the ground and then kind of levering open with pickaxes the rock that had been cracked by the heat. It felt like 130, 140 plus. So these are the circumstances into which many of these displaced, climate-battered rural villagers are traveling, not, of course, because they deem this to be any kind of desirable outcome, but it's a reflection of the degrees of immiseration and desperation that collapsing agriculture in so many rural areas is inducing. I think I'm going to come up with 2 or 3 final points before turning things over to you to ask any questions you might have. One is what I perhaps think of as the climate intangibles. And that's that while I try and tilt at this a little bit in my book, the very fact that there are kind of parts of the puzzle that we seemingly don't yet fully understand. But one of them is the ways in which climate-related sleeplessness, climate-related sleep deprivation is bleeding into the kinds of poor decision-making that are often characteristic in violent situations. I'll give you an example. In parts of Mali that I've worked in, such as the degree of nighttime heat. It used to be that temperatures would relent considerably at night, and of course up to a point they do, but they don't dip in ways that they once did. And that is contributing to much greater degrees of poor sleep. And this is something that the villagers alike and many security officials have invoked to me as a kind of an ever-present in many of the kind of farmer-herder sort of violent disputes that they're increasingly having to mediate. Another one is, the ways in which climate-related troubles are sort of bleeding into forms of trauma. And by that I mean the very fact that birds are often not migrating during the periods of the year they once did, the very fact that plants are often blooming at different periods if they bloom at all, the fact that most importantly of all, of course, rains are not falling when they once did, that kind of loss of sort of everything that many of these sort of villagers have sort of ever known, that kind of consistent inconsistency of conditions, is leading, as far as I can see, to all sorts of forms of kind of wild and deranged and often irrational behavior. And I interviewed quite a lot of these captured ISIS prisoners of war, and particularly among those from these sort of rural settings, as so many of them were, I was sort of almost always keen to sort of understand the process that had kind of persuaded them to sort of join a group of the kind of brutality that they did. And even on the occasions where I kind of gave them a little bit of a softball, I was kind of wondering if they would kind of seize the possibility of presenting a self-serving narrative. Many of them just really could not make sense of the kind of decision-making process that had kind of got them to that point. A penultimate point, and this goes back to what I was referring to earlier with the so what factor. This is an issue that both I in this book and others in this field have mostly looked at in the context of poor countries, and there's very good reason for that. Part of that is that most climate-related violence is that kind of unhappy combination of climate stresses with poor governance, and both of those in particular are present in spades in poorer places. But as our own climate conditions kind of deteriorate in parts of the rich world, and as our own quality of governance nosedives in places, bit by bit we're starting to see variations of kind of lesser forms of climate-related violence. And I live in Athens in Greece, and I've been working with a women's NGO to set up a series of focus groups for both Greek and refugee women. And what we found so far is that rates of violence against women in Athens increased 250 or possibly 300% between the months of June and September. Now, there's a number of reasons for that are not related to extreme heat, the very fact that kids are not in school, there's an array of other stressors in the summer months. But, I mean, in the aftermath of Hurricane Beryl in the Texas area in July, women's shelters in the Houston area also had unprecedented rates of occupancy and calls. So this is something we know to be a phenomenon. And then just an additional way of illustrating that, there are a lot of examples of how this is playing out in Europe and North America. Slightly less tragic example, but anybody who buys olive oil will have been aware that prices have gone through the roof in the last 2 or 3 years, mostly due to drought along the Mediterranean periphery, which produces the vast majority of the world's olive oil. But because the price has surged for reasons that are mostly grounded in climate-related drought, thieves, including everybody from opportunistic criminals through to kind of organized crime outfits, have been incentivized by these much higher prices to attack and burgle olive oil depots and even olive trees. If you come into land at Athens Airport, for example, you're kind of in the middle of this large Attica olive basin. You go to basically every one of those farms, and they've had to massively maximize security, and in many instances have had these opportunistic middle-of-the-night swoops from thieves on bikes, just such are the prices that the olives and olive oil are commanding. And then a final point, and this is the optimism that I've been sort of vaguely working towards. Well, 2 points here. One is that one can get the sense, there's the argument that there's just this kind of thin veneer of civilizations sort of preventing us from kind of stumbling into a Hobbesian and Lord of the Flies-esque sort of war of all against all. But the thing that I found particularly striking in so many of these extremely poor, extremely struggling, out-of-the-way communities in Africa, the Middle East, and South Asia, I found super striking is that there's not more violence than there actually is, despite the fact that so often the circumstances and officialdom are kind of thrusting people against one another. The reality is that people are kind of granted the tools and the mechanisms to keep the peace. The vast majority are seizing upon them, kind of hungrily, like a camel in the desert. And then the final point is that while there is indeed a strong amount of suffering that's kind of baked in, and while this is indeed a kind of prelude of likely significantly more complicated future that awaits us without kind of meaningful climate action, none of this is inevitable. Like, with every kind of little bit of warming that we can rein in, it does massively diminish the chances of us ending with the kinds of conditions in which agriculture is even less viable than it already is in many places. It ensures that governments are not dealing with kind of even greater and more debilitating kinds of extreme weather events, with all the complications that poses for infrastructure and water and food security. So this doesn't have to come to pass. That's what I was, the last sort of moderately hopeful note that I'm keen to leave you with. Yeah. Thank you.